I'm here with Christian Widener. Christian is someone I saw on another podcast who has really done incredible work on providing actual evidence of end times prophecy. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And he is the author of a very powerful book called Witnessing the End, Daniel's 77s and the final decree that everyone missed. We'll touch on that on this call today. But first and foremost, Christian, thank you and welcome to the call.
Thank you so much for having me, Peter. I appreciate it.
I think it's imperative to just get a little bit of bio and background out of the way so that people know who you are and how you got into this. Actually, I personally find that kind of interesting when you shared that with me earlier, but tell folks who you are, where you come from, how you got into setting up your blog, and why you're now talking about end times prophecy on your YouTube channel.
Okay, so I was raised in a Christian home, and I've been sort of a believer most of my life. But I went, kind of just went to school, became an engineer, and things about prophecy, stuff like that. I just studied on my own, just because I was interested, and really had a very successful career. I traveled the world building power plants for a time. Met my wife, and that's kind of a tough gig if you're married. So I started thinking, hey, maybe I should go back to school. And I went back to school and got into research and development in advanced metals and repair and coatings and things like that. And got my PhD. I was a director of a research lab that did about $1 million a year of funded research. We filed for some patents. I started a company. So, I'm just studying the Bible because I'm a believer and I believe it's true and I'm interested. And then as 2020 rolled around and things started converging and a lot of the things that I've been studying started to line up, that's really when I looked for a way to leave that. And basically, in 2020, I left all that behind, and I've just been writing and blogging about the end times since that period.
Gotcha. Well, the intention for this call is to speak to those like myself who I call recovering casual Christians. I've grown up in Christianity, but the last few years have really brought to my attention just how little I really knew of the Bible, if I'm being quite honest. So, as I started to see things begin to manifest from the book of Revelation, it was a kick in the butt, basically, to get back to the Bible and better understand what's been said, what the prophecies are. Are we really in end times? Is this really happening? That's just such a wild thing to comprehend. And yet, when I started to reverse engineer it, I started to see certain things too. But it's awesome to hear there's folks like you who are out there who have done extensive research. And I want to appeal to your engineer mind here and hope
Yeah.
that we can have a conversation where we could set up the format. My goal is to talk about on a macro level what are the primary signs of end times prophecy, and let's first lay out that map, and then if we can go through and kind of tackle each one or at least touch on each one because we could talk about any one of those for an entire podcast episode in and of itself. But I want to give up essentially a flyby overview of end times prophecies so the listeners can have some kind of basis, some kind of framework that they can then go do extensive more research. Obviously, go to your channel, read your book, and perhaps have you back on, and we can go dive deeper into one of these. So, from
Sure.
from an end times prophecy standpoint, what are the big milestone things that we should be seeing that we can look to the Bible and also look to current events and go, whoa, this is actually these are lining up.
The simplest sign that most people recognize as an indication that we were in like the last of the last days is the return of Israel as a nation. And that was a huge deal because it's prophesied that that God says, even I will gather you a second time. So Israel was destroyed, and Jerusalem, both the northern kingdom and even the southern kingdom, were totally destroyed and defeated in the 500s. 538 BC, Jerusalem was razed. All the people of Israel were scattered. They took the people of Judah up to Babylon, and that's kind of like the first exile. And that's where we get the book of Daniel, which is one of the big, prophecy. That's the whole point of what I was referencing. The book is a prophecy from Daniel. But that was the first time. Then they were brought back 70 years later in fulfillment of prophecy, and they were restored to the land. But then fast forward to the time of Jesus. Jesus dies on the cross. Not, another 40 years later, less than that, in 70 AD, Israel's destroyed again. Jerusalem's razed, the temples is set on fire, and the Jewish people are scattered again. And the Jewish nation from that time ceased to exist. But there was these prophecies that said, but in the last days, I'm going to gather you from all the nations that I've scattered to you and bring you again into your land, and that it would be a wasteland, and that when they come back, the desert would bloom, it would bear fruit, and all kinds of things like what we see today with the modern state of Israel. And so that's kind of the first clue. And like I said, one of these verses even says, I will bring you back a second time. Not just that generically I'm going to bring you back when you go, oh, when could that refer to? It's even prophesying that it would be twice. And so we see that and we go, yes, that should mean something significant. Israel, people used to joke about Israel becoming a nation again, as if that couldn't be. And yet you also have Christian sources, like even someone like Isaac Newton. Still, he actually had this side that wrote a lot about prophecy, and he saw, yes, the scriptures indicate that Israel is going to be a nation again, and that should happen in the future. And so a lot of people have recognized this, but not everybody believed it could be literal. And that's fine. You can debate, should something be taken literally or figuratively? But when it happens literally, then I think that should remove the doubt. And you still have people that would doubt that. They would say, no, that's just a coincidence. That's man fulfilling God's word. God never meant that. I trust that God actually sees the future. And when he writes a prophecy, it doesn't matter how it's fulfilled. He's telling us what's going to happen, not how it's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So when we see it happen, we should recognize that's a fulfillment of prophecy. And so
Yeah,
that's pretty much the biggest sign that says we're in the last days, is that they're back.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's a fundamental one, understanding the full story of the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
and the fall of man from the very beginning to the bringing back to into union with God. Um, so we saw Israel become a nation in, was it 1947, 48,
48. Yep. Well,
48?
47, 48. 47, the UN sort of gave them permission. In 1948, they actually declared statehood.
Okay. So that's sort of point number one. What are some of the other, as we're doing this quick overview, macro style, what are the other things that we should be seeing in end times?
So the other things that you would see is not only would Israel be back, but that they would be, surrounded by their enemies. That basically their ancient enemies would still be their modern enemies. And that seems kind of, also without it being prophesied, you would go, who could hold a grudge for 2,000 years, right? Wouldn't that eventually go away?
Yeah.
Like why is this still the same drama 2,000, 3,000 years later? How are the same sort of regions that were Israel's ancient enemies, how are they still being attacked from those same regions today? So
Hmm.
those were things also that you would see, that the whole world would be against Israel, that everybody would be concerned about, Jerusalem. It would be a rock of offense, to the nations. The nations would be raging over Jerusalem. And that's like another unbelievable thing to have written, 2,500 years ago, that the whole world would be watching Jerusalem and care about it.
Hmm.
Right? Like that anybody could have predicted any one city in the world would have been the focus of attention 2,500 years later. I mean, it just seems unlikely, except that that's exactly what God said. That's the city that he chose. It's the place that Satan is opposing the works of God. And so it's always been the center of attention, because spiritually, right, there's significance there. It's not random that's the center of the world's attention even today.
Hmm. Some of the other things that I have pulled out from Revelation, of course, we have the rise of Antichrist. We should be
Mm-hmm.
seeing signs of that. The mark of the beast is another one that people tend to be familiar with.
It's true.
Um, uh, let's see, the abomination of desolation, which you've done some incredible, interesting investigation around. And
Yes.
we'll touch on that in just a second. I know we have a lot to share there. The tribulation, the rapture, seals being opened. So there's a lot here to unpack in just a very brief short of time, but we're going to do our best to at least touch on these, and give the recovering casual Christian, as they say, a little bit of meat to sink their teeth into so that they can go do more research. One of the things that you and I discussed offline, that was another sign of the times with was apostasy. Can you explain what that is and where we're seeing that in the world today?
Yeah. So another thing that's prophesied about the last days is that there would be a great falling away of the church. That because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most would grow cold. And so you go, well, what is that? And you're seeing it today. You're seeing a lot of departure from what has been Orthodox Christianity for 2,000 years. Like, for example, when the Pope recently announced that all religions are paths to God, like, I don't know how many people understand how huge that is, but the leader of the Catholic Church who claims to speak for Christ on the earth has said, actually, you know what? We were kind of wrong all these years. It doesn't really matter what faith you believe. Every path is going to get you to God. There is no exclusivity anymore. I mean, that's total apostasy. It's anathema to say that. It's heresy, and it's coming out of the mouth of the Pope, who's the leader of the Catholic Church.
Hmm.
So that would be like a big indication that yes, we are in a time. Also, just churches in general not really believing the Bible is the inspired word of God anymore. Not believing in classic doctrines of the church would also be another sort of sign. And if I could just add in general, why are we looking for prophecy at all? Is because a third of the Bible is prophecy. Christ's first coming was in fulfillment of 200 to 300 prophecies, depending on who's counting. And it's more than enough to kind of say, yep, that's an amazing fulfillment. And we have more prophecies even about Christ's return than we do about his first coming, because a lot of the Old Testament prophecies that have been fulfilled are actually double prophecies. They're about a coming conquering king, and they were about a coming suffering servant who would redeem mankind and pay the penalty for sin. So you see both sort of comings in the Old Testament, and then the New Testament is every book of the Bible just about, and the New Testament talks about the return of Christ and the
Hmm.
hope that we have. So we're watching because we were told to watch, and because we were given this prophetic word about what signs to look for the end. And like I said, the apostasy is another one that would be something that would come before Christ would return. The church would start to fall away.
Hmm. I have personally experienced some of that where I didn't feel at home in the church that I was in, and as I started to pull away, I started to use that same type of lexicon where it was, um, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. I thought, in other words,
Yeah.
I'm not in the dogma of the church, but I believe in God and I feel a relationship to God and I'm pursuing that relationship. And it wasn't, uh, so I think there is a sect of people who might be in that space, where the Pope was saying that might be very appealing to people to say,
Yeah.
hey, you know, you see good people from all walks of life. Are we not all God's children, and are we all not pointing to some higher truth? There's a general feeling that there's maybe some truth to that. However, as I've become to better respect, when you look at the biblical um, prophecy manifesting right in front of your eyes, and then you look at what the rest of the Bible says, there's a very clear. There's only one way. I am the way, the
Yeah.
life, and truth, or the truth and love.
Yeah. And
Um,
even in Jesus's day, the religious leaders of the day were primarily the ones that were his chief opponents, right?
mm,
And he was appealing to the everyday person who had also sort of been marginalized in some of that. The Pharisees were accused of tying heavy burdens on the backs of the people, giving them all these rules, and yet they themselves were not willing to lift a finger, to help them, right? So
mhm.
we're in a similar place, I think. Yes, it's not through man's traditions and all the stuff we want to pile on and call religion. It's really from the Word of God. It's the Holy Spirit who indwells the believer in Jesus Christ. That's a real relationship with God is personal.
Hmm.
It's not, a whole series of do this and don't do that.
Yeah, that was a big awakening in my personal journey from going from a historical relationship to Christ, and knowing what he did, knowing the example, and feeling deep love and respect for that to, the ability to have a relationship with him in the here and the now. I mean, that changed everything for me.
Yeah.
Um, Let's talk about the tribulation. Explain to
Mhm.
people what that is and where you believe we are within that frame.
Okay, so even that, like there, I'll just start out by saying there is no topic in Bible prophecy that's not controversial to the people who have studied it and come up with positions. So one of the daunting things about beginning to dip your toe into the prophecy world is everybody has some opinion. No, that's not what's in the scripture. This is what's in the scripture.
Hmm.
And so the topic of the tribulation is also how long is it? The essential idea is that it's 7 years long, which comes from Daniel 9. And that just talks about this final week or this final 7 year period. But within that, in the book of Revelation, it talks about a great tribulation, a great period of time that would be 42 months. That the beast from the sea would rise and would be given authority to act. And so then we see that period of time. And then there's in the book of Revelation that describes seven seals, seven trumpets, and seven bowls. But we don't know exactly when those come. And just by reading them, you can see the really heavy part of the tribulation starts with the first trumpet. The trumpets and the bowls are the big part. The seals are something that I've written about and talked about. Those being actually, we're already in the process of those being open. Those are called the birth pains. And so, depending on what you mean, there's sort of various parts, but the main part would be 7 years. The second half is where it's concentrated. And I think even the worst parts are in the last half of that last, 42 months.
Hmm.
So, depends on what people mean and what they're thinking about. And that's why there's kind of a lot of confusion because we're not all meaning the same things when we're talking about those terms, right? But
Let me ask you
there it is.
a more fundamental question. What is the tribulation? Like, why do we need the tribulation for those that are getting up to speed with all of biblical prophecy? What is the tribulation in the first place, and why do we need it? Why
So
does God need it?
right, the last days are said. It's said that the days will be like the days of Noah, when the whole world turned against God, turned away from God, and it would be like the days of Sodom and Gomorrah, when the world really wanted to define morality on their own terms and engage in all kinds of wickedness. That to the man, basically, people had turned and rejected God's laws. And it's told that then the last days would be a time where people would be increasingly moving away from God. And if you just took America as an example, it was founded as a Christian nation where, nearly 90, 5+ % of the people would have said, oh yeah, I'm a Christian. I believe in the Bible, to a place where, it's being threatened whether we can really even say we're a Christian nation anymore.
Hmm.
I'd say we still are. That's what we're founded on. But certainly that's not the majority opinion necessarily of America. In fact, if people have heard of George Barna, he did some surveys, of what percentage of America has a biblical worldview, and it's under 10%.
Mm.
According to that. So that's we have departed a long ways from our roots, and in that there's a place where God's not going to just let man go his own way. So
Hmm.
there is a point at a time of judgment that's kind of this far and no further. And there's also an idea that really God only meant for man to have 6,000 years on earth.
Hmm.
And this is an idea that, for the 6 days of creation, a day with the Lord is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. So the 6 days of man's creation would be 6,000 years for man's government. And then there would be followed by a Sabbath day rest, or 1,000 years where Christ would actually rule physically on the earth. And that's what people call the millennium. That's the thing. But in order to transition from man's world and man trying to do things on his own and rebel against God, the king has to come and set the world straight. And
Hmm.
that's the trouble. That's the judgment. That's the wrath for all those who have put themselves directly in opposition to God and said, nope, we're not going to accept your rule. We're going to throw off your chains. We're not going to go the direction that you've tried to make us go, even though you're our creator. God's only going to let that go so far. Like, he loves us, but just like a good father, he gives you give your kids a little slack. We can't try to make them do perfectly everything that we want, but there is a place that if your kid keeps saying no, that you're going to say nope, this far and no further.
Hmm.
And God's going to do that with us. And I think that is all really already begun. That's the shift. Even like when you talked with Renee and your last podcast, Martinez,
Mm-hmm.
he's like, there was a shift, you could feel it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the thing that we're talking about, that we're in right now.
Mm-hmm. So, within that context, you talked about the seals, the bowls. What you, I think you alluded to a mention ago that we're already starting to see some of those. What are some examples of that?
So the seals begin, the first four seals begin this time of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And people may have heard of the four horsemen. It's a white horse who rides out conquering and to conquer, and he carries a bow. There's a red horse that has a great sword, and he's given power to take peace from the earth and to make men slay one another. And the third horse is a black horse who has a pair of scales in his hand, and he cries out, a quart of wheat for a denarius and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not damage the oil and the wine, which kind of seems to talk about inflation, trouble for the poor, not necessarily for the rich, because the oil and the wine are not to be damaged. And then finally a pale horse or a green horse whose rider's name is Death. And hell falls with them, and the four horsemen are given power over a quarter of the earth to kill by the combined plagues of war, famine, pestilence, and the wild beasts of the earth. And so that's kind of a terrifying image. And but what we're not told is exactly when that starts and how fast all that happens. What will that look like? And Jesus also makes statements like they will be eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, planting and building right up until the end.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you put those images together, and those things are going to start, and they're going to increase over time, and they're going to start to get, grow exponentially and really get worse near the end when the judgments are fully setting in. But that we would see them start, and that when we start to feel that, and that would be then the beginning of the birth pains.
Mm. Um, okay, so let's move on to there's so much more to this,
Yes.
people who are listening, like so much more. So please go seek out Christian stuff on his YouTube channel to dive deeper, and also the book. But in for the sake of time, I want to now move on to the Antichrist. That one is a very big one of has garnered a lot of interest, understandably. What is your
Yep.
thought on that? Are we seeing, do we know who it is? Is it a single person? Is it symbolic? What is your thought on the Antichrist?
Right. Yeah. And you could really put, both of these are, like you mentioned, are already the Antichrist and the mark of the beast, which were
Hmm.
two sort of, signs of the end. But they're describing someone who's going to take over the earth, right? An evil global dictator. And a lot of people have seen it as just one person who's going to rise to power. But the interesting thing is, if you look at a lot of these prophecies about Daniel, they talk about this last kingdom being unlike any other that's ever been on the earth before. And so the interesting thing about that is, wouldn't a single global dictator be like any other kingdom that we've had before on the earth? That's all our big world powers have been a single guy in power over the whole earth.
Hmm.
And so I think it's actually more talking about the kind of global government we're seeing today, where you have a multipolar world order. The last beast is described as this multi-headed beast. And so I think actually, instead of just one antichrist, we're looking for a gang of evildoers, right? That are the leaders, the world leaders. They're the nations and groups that are in power and controlling the earth, but it's a bunch of groups, and
Hmm.
they're sort of all coordinating together. And we see, through the UN and the World Health Organization and other, global governing bodies like that, we're seeing this sort of collaboration between different heads. And so I think that's there. But it just, even 10 years ago, you would have hardly said, oh, I definitely see how some of these groups could really start actually governing the whole world, like a one world government system,
Hmm.
something that a person might be able to take power over. I think you can have prominent people, like there is a head to the UN, right? There is, Klaus Schwab used to be the head of the World Health Organization. So we do have prominent leader people, but it's not like there's just one. And so that's what I see happening. And, we see the need for technology to control buying and selling. We see a technology to be able to give people a unique identifier, Like now you can get your identity stolen. I mean, we're going digital, but it's not secure. So you can see a lot of this stuff forming, and it just happens to also look like things in Bible prophecy that we're told.
Hmm.
And at a certain point, we're really asking the question, so is that a coincidence? Or can we admit and recognize that the Bible told us 2,000 years ago what to watch for, and it's
Hmm.
finally arrived?
Yes, I think one um, fundamental thing that people can examine is consolidation of power and centralization of power.
Yeah.
And um, because there's an argument out there that says, oh, Christian, yes, there's signs of war, but there's always been war. I'm sure people who lived during World War II thought it was the end of the world. I mean, how would it
Yes.
not feel that way? Isn't this just another cycle of humanity going through? And to me, one of the biggest caveats to that, or a wrench into that whole thing, is the consolidation of power. We've never really had a time that I'm aware of where we've had the centralization and consolidation of power all rolled up into a very tiny few, into very tiny few hands,
Yeah.
with the ability to scale power. And now that everything is going digital, you can have somebody, sitting in Switzerland saying, I don't like what Christian said on social media. No travel for Christian for 30 days. And if we're all using crypto and we're all using digital, means to live our lives, it can be managed, it can be controlled. So, that
Yeah.
to me is a big shift, or something that we haven't really seen in world history, as far as I'm aware. Um,
Yeah. 100%.
the BRICS nations is a
Yep.
coalition. For those that are not aware, BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, Saudi Arabia. No,
South
South
America.
America. I
I
think
mean,
Saudi,
sorry, South Africa.
South Africa. Yes, South
Same
Africa,
thing.
and then, but then that's those are five nations right there. There's, I think, and there's plenty of other nations that are wanting to be a part of the BRICS coalition. Is that part of the 10 heads, the 10 horns?
Uh, so there's a mystery about the final world kingdom is a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. And so people have been looking for groups of 7 and groups of 10.
Hmm.
And the BRICS have, I think, another 5 members that are in the waiting in the wings. So you could go, oh, there's a group of 10 nations, maybe that's it. And that's certainly possible. But when they talk about the image of the beast, everybody understands that this beast with 7 heads and 10 horns rising out of the sea, it's symbolic. Like we're not literally looking for some kind of dragon monster out of the Godzilla movies that's coming out of the sea. We're thinking of this as a world government system with a bunch of different heads. And the BRICS, I think, are more like just one of the heads.
Mm.
And the numbers 7 and 10 are actually both very symbolic numbers themselves. They're
Hmm.
numbers of kind of completeness. So in the book of Revelation, it talks about the 7 churches. And we understand that that's not meaning that there are only 7 churches, that set number 7 is like the totality of the churches, and it's giving
Hmm.
7 specific examples,
Hmm.
right? But it's not really that there's only 7.
Hmm.
And so it might be that there's 7 groups, mean all the world groups. 10 horns, like your 10 fingers. If you have all your 10 fingers, that means all of your fingers. And
Mm.
so it's also like all the world leaders, all of the world's groups are going to be part of this beast.
Mm.
And really that's what we see at the United Nations, right? The whole world, even though we have enemies and we're developing like, really close to open hot war and World War III, people are still all sitting at the same table and they're meeting and they're discussing world policy and voting on decisions. They
Hmm.
just voted on this. Well, they didn't actually vote on the Pact for the Future, but they met on the Pact for the Future. And but that, even approving that, is another sort of big move towards global government, that we
Hmm.
all sort of covenant. We're going to sign by consensus and approve, this set of rules that we're going to operate by. I mean, that's just wild,
Yeah.
because it's people that, do you really trust those people on the other side of the table? And yet we're all pretending that we're going to work together and get along.
Yeah. We have not done a very good job of that historically. So, let's Well, let me ask you a quick question then. There was some people, Tim, is it Cohen, I think his name was, that talked
Yeah.
about King Charles potentially being the Antichrist, had some very interesting evidence to suggest that that was the case. What is your take on that?
It is a compelling case. I I think again it's bigger than just one guy.
Hmm.
So I don't see King Charles really being the absolute indisputed leader of the world in the overt sort of sense that we imagine that there's going to be one single antichrist. But who knows that who knew that he was the one that helped come up with the Great Reset and then gave that to Klaus Schwab, and Klaus Schwab had King Charles or Prince Charles then unveil it to the world with him,
Hmm.
and his hand in a lot of these globalist efforts, and the fact that he's over all the British Commonwealth countries. I mean, there's a lot of things that are behind the British monarchy,
Hmm.
and he's over a big part of the world already. He controls an unfathomable amount of money and resources and land. So he's certainly a player on the global stage that I think most of the world is sort of, or a good part of the world is overlooked. So Tim, I think pointing was rightly pointed out, look at all these things. He's called his call sign is the red dragon. There's all these satanic imageries associated with him. He put out a gold sovereign recently where he was riding the red dragon. And to me, that's just
Yeah.
his portrait that he put out that
Oh, that
was
was wild. If for those
overtly
that are listening,
satanic.
for those that are listening, if you've not seen the portrait that he had commissioned, and then also the controversy around it, where people took mirrored images of it, you have to go look that up. It's very eyebrow raising to say the least.
Yeah,
I
so there's plenty to think about with him.
For sure, logic would tell me if we are dealing with the demonic realm here, if we're dealing with Satan himself, Satan is not going to want, at least at some point, maybe from a deceptive standpoint, he'd want the attention to be spread across, seven nations or seven heads, etc.
Mhm.
Don't you think, though, at some point he's going to want to come out and say, like, it's me? After all, his biggest sin was pride. At some point, isn't he going to want to say, hey, here he is? It's been me the whole time. It's pull back the curtain. I'm the Oz, Is that not,
Yeah.
wouldn't logic suggest that it might be that it eventually might come down to one person?
Yeah, well, and we're even told there's a prominent horn who speaks great boasts, right? That this
Hmm.
beast would have. So there will be somebody who's clearly sort of uh, speaking for the dragon in a sense. And we're told about a false prophet who will look like a lamb but speak like a dragon. But he has two horns. I mean, there's a lot of these images that are tough to fully grasp until you're looking at the person who's done the rest of the things. That so so I like to keep an open mind, because I think we our tendency is to want to try to nail it down, right?
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
before it's fully happened, and I think the best way is to understand what we're looking for. You see lots of people who are coming out who are filling these different roles, but there's coming a time when the Antichrist, when the lawless one will set himself up in God's temple and declare himself to be God.
Hmm.
We don't know exactly how that's going to happen, but it seems like someone making some really monstrous statements at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, for example,
Hmm.
is would be sort of the most literal understanding of that. And so that certainly, once someone's done that, that's that's something to consider. There's also the number of the beast, 666, and Tim has pointed out, for example, how that could fit with King Charles. And so that's certainly something to consider. But 666 can be put together for a lot of different people. I mean, they've
Hmm.
been trying since Emperor Nero, in the days of the early church. So there's lots of formulas, and Satan has been working through different people, all these years. Like, who Satan offered all the kingdoms of the earth to Jesus in the 40 days of temptation in the wilderness,
Hmm.
and he's saying all these are mine and I can give them to whoever I want. And so you've got to think that for all this last 2,000 years, every person who's in major power over these kingdoms, and in a sense is there because Satan has given them that power. And
Hmm.
that doesn't mean that God hasn't ever had any godly people that have been allowed to be in certain places at certain times, but essentially those kingdoms are under his control and influence. And even today, the people in big positions of power, you've got to say that they're there because Satan has given it to them.
All right. Well, I have to ask the question. We are now a few days after the election. Trump just got elected into presidency. Where does he fit into all this in your mind?
Well, he's certainly a horn. The United States, I think, is one of the world powers. So I think the United States, like it or not, right, we are part of this world government system. In fact, we proposed a lot of the World Health regulations. Who started the United Nations? You know, the
Hmm.
United States had a big hand in that.
Hmm.
Who's a big funder of it? It's the United States. So it is interesting, and yet if I look at the two candidates, we had one who, at her rally, when people held up a sign that said Jesus is Lord, she
Yeah.
mocked them and told them they were at the wrong rally.
Yeah.
You should have been at Trump's rally. So you do have a party that is, embraces God and the need for people to be saved. I've heard Trump, talk about, Jesus Christ and that positive light. And certainly the Republican Party has more people who openly and easily identify as being Christians. And so you do see a difference. Trump has, embraced that. If we had voted, if we had gotten 4 years of Kamala, I think that would have been terrible for religious freedom. It would have been terrible for just freedom in general in this country. I don't think that that would have been, a good direction.
Hmm.
But, Trump has some amazing things that happen, like the assassination attempt that gave him a head wound.
Hmm.
And, one of the heads of the beast receives as if a fatal wound, and the whole world wonders, and then follows after him. And Trump is liked by, countries, not just people in the US, but around the world. It was a near fatal head wound. The whole world did marvel. I don't know if there's anybody in the world that didn't hear about Trump's near assassination attempt.
Hmm.
An assassination attempt on a president of the United States, like that's news around the globe.
Hmm.
So he is a boastful guy. If Trump has a weakness, it's pride.
Hmm.
And so those are all kinds of things that you might look to. And yet he's the one who's defending, I think, religious liberty at this present time. He's calling for a return to, America being a godly nation, or a nation under God, that kind of thing. So I'm not ready um to call it on Trump, but there are a lot of people out there who would say he's fitting some of the things that we're told to watch for the Antichrist.
I kind of go back and forth in my mind too as I try to assess what's going on, and certainly the head wound is a very, very prominent one. Of course, we're pointing to some of the biblical passage out of the Book of Revelation that talks about that.
Yeah.
Um, but to your point, he's also doing a lot of the right moves and going after the atrocities, the sex trafficking, the just and discussing. The things that are really hurting the average American people with inflation and those sort of things. So it certainly seems like he is a significant player. I'm just not sure which team he's on yet, if I'm being honest. His
Yes.
his relationship with Elon too. Also, Elon's another very, very interesting guy where saying and doing a lot of the right things, but they're just I have reservations. So, especially when it
Right.
comes to the mark of the beast, we know in the book of Revelation it talks about that there will be a point in time where people will not be able to purchase what they need, what they want, like groceries, etc., unless they have a mark on the forehead or the hand. And Elon has talked extensively about technology that puts a chip either in the brain with a neural lace, the technology that he talks about there. We're already seeing signs of like we'll go to Whole Foods and they have the palm reader. It's almost like a preconditioning that yeah, you're going to pay with your hand.
Hmm.
Um, what's your take on Elon?
Yeah. Well, I wish he would lose the, Satan's champion suit and
Yep.
icon that, or his picture site pick that he likes to use. That's a really tough one for me. Like,
I know.
Satan's champion, you mean like the Antichrist? I mean,
Yeah.
you want to wear an Antichrist costume and like that's no big deal. It certainly suggests he doesn't understand the spiritual battle that is, I think, raging right now. He's not looking at the world biblically, and so it's either you're able to be deceived easily, or yeah, I'm not sure. I'm with you. I don't know what team you're on.
Yeah. Well, time will tell where we are watching. Let's talk about now the abomination of desolation. This is something that you brought some very, very interesting evidence forth. But before we get into that specifically, talk about what we're even talking about. What is the abomination of desolation? Um, why is that
So
part of end times prophecy?
the biggest thing, that why do we think there needs to be this abomination of desolation, is because Jesus talked about it in his Olivet discourse before he was crucified. Before he finished his ministry on earth. He talked to his disciples. They asked him some questions. What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And so he goes into this long dialogue about all the things, that the big signs that would lead up to the last days. And then he goes and he talks about the birth pains, these things in the seals that we've already talked about. And then he says, and when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, then let the reader understand, those in Judea should flee to the hilltops or to the mountains. And that's the kind of thing that you go, oh, Jesus said there would be an abomination of desolation that would come after these birth pains has started, and that we should look at Daniel. And so then you flip back to Daniel, and Daniel chapter 9 talks about, in the middle of this final week, or this final 7 years, that there would be an abomination of desolation. And so, oh, he's pointing us to the prophecy of 70 weeks, and even to this final week, and that this would be of the time of the end. And what's interesting about that is the prophecy of 70 weeks pointed to Christ's first coming, because it says, from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, which is kind of like 483 years.
Mhm.
That's don't get lost in those numbers, because now I'm going to confuse people. But basically, it was telling this time from this decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, which happened when it was first destroyed, like I mentioned, by the Nebuchadnezzar. He destroyed Jerusalem, and then later it was decreed to be rebuilt and restored. But after that counted 483 years to the arrival of Jesus Christ. And that was one of the signs. That was one of the ways that the Pharisees were supposed to recognize Christ's coming.
Mhm.
But then he's talking to his disciples and he's saying, oh, yeah, but that's still, this abomination of desolation is still in the future. So that decree still has something to say about my return, not just my first coming. And so then we start looking for that. And that event was supposed to be in the middle of 7 years. And we had this event on October 7th, that, yes, I make the case that this actually was the abomination of desolation that was written about. It was exactly 3.5 years after the start of COVID, which I would say was the beginning of birth pains. That was the big tectonic shift that people, I don't know if anyone wouldn't say they didn't feel the world shift in
Mhm.
2020. They might not say they know why or what they think it meant or anything like that, but it's hard to say you didn't feel it.
Mhm.
I mean, it's just like, yeah, it was crazy. And
Mhm.
maybe we've started to forget already. But in that time, it was, I think it was palpable to pretty much everybody.
Yeah, for sure. You're talking about the October 7th event. Explain the running to the hilltops connection to it.
Yeah. So what's strange is it says, that those in Judea must flee to the mountains. And you go, well, the attack in Gaza, what was that? That wasn't in Judea, was it? And if people know their biblical history, Israel was one kingdom under Solomon, and then after that, his son wasn't really, didn't follow the Lord, and the kingdom was split in two, and the northern tribes became Israel, and the southern tribes became Judah. And so the land of Israel was split in half. The southern part was Judah, the northern part was Israel.
Hmm.
Well, this Gaza part is the southern part of Israel. It's the part that was Judea. And so that attack actually came in Judah, and it attacked in the plains and near the ocean. And 150, 200,000 people were forced to flee in the immediate vicinity and even the wider vicinity around Gaza and in that open part of Israel. And they fled to the high ground, which is the mountains. So they
Mm.
actually did, and if you didn't leave right away, you maybe didn't make it, because those guys were flying in, they were getting vehicles, they were driving. That it turns out, I think the latest initial estimates were 1,000 and 3,000. I think the last estimate I saw was that there must have been at least 6,000 Hamas terrorists that were filtering out and attacking all over that southern part of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So you see that and you go, oh, well, that was just like what's described. But it's also, you say, it says standing in the holy place, which we understand as the Temple Mount. We understand that as the Holy of Holies, or the temple area itself. And you go, well, that the attack wasn't in Gaza. I mean, it wasn't in the temple, it was in Gaza. But when they attacked, they named the war the Al-Aqsa flood. And like, so what's Al-Aqsa? Al-Aqsa is the mosque at the southern end of the Temple Mount. But in, Muslim minds, Al-Aqsa means the whole Temple Mount.
Mm.
It's not just the mosque, it's the whole temple area. So they called it the Temple Mount Flood War, to sort of translate what they're meaning when they say that. And even Muslim sources and Jewish sources both said in the aftermath of this, hey guys, the war is not about Gaza. This war is about the Temple Mount.
Mm.
So both jihadist minded Muslims and Jews were of the same mindset, that yes, we know this war is not about Gaza. So once you see that, then you go, oh, so the whole war, even though it wasn't at the Temple Mount, it was based on the Temple Mount. It was justified on. So standing on can also sort of mean symbolically that that's the justification for it.
Mm. What exactly was the controversy with that, or what was the justification for the? You said that they both agreed that it was about the Temple Mount. What
Yeah.
was the violation from the?
So because it's really about control of the Temple Mount and who can worship there. So the interesting thing about the Temple Mount itself is that it was not under the control of Israel prior to 1948. I mean, actually in 1948, it kind of was, and then it was under sort of international control maybe. But Jordan immediately, and many nations, Egypt, Syria, they all invaded Israel the day that they declared statehood, or the next day, whatever. And so that set up a war. Then they made a 1949 armistice line eventually that cut Jerusalem in half. So the west part of Jerusalem was under Israeli control, and the east side, which included the old city, was under Jordanian control. And the Temple Mount was then, controlled by Jordan. Well, then 1967, Jordan invades again, unprovoked. Israel defends themselves, and they actually push Jordan all the way back, across the Jordan, and they take over control of Jerusalem, the whole city, and they have the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is in our hands. But elements within the Israeli government, in order to sort of try to, well, who knows, either prevent the religious Jews from gaining too much power and influence, which is probably a political decision, but they gave over control of the Temple Mount back to Jordan. And so, like, wait a minute, the guys that just invaded you and tried to wipe you out have, you've defeated them. You get the Temple Mount, which is the holiest place on earth for Jews, and you give it right back to the guys who just tried to kill you.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that doesn't make sense.
Mm-mm.
It's actually a fulfillment of prophecy, though, in Ezekiel 44. It says, but among all your other things that you did, you didn't take charge of my holy things, but you set foreigners in charge of my sanctuary.
Mm.
And so it's actually an amazing fulfillment of prophecy. And it's either 44 or 43. If you go look, someone will find this. But it's just an amazing prophecy that the Jews would somehow give control of the sanctuary back to foreigners. And you go, what? No, they would never do that. That's ridiculous. Why would they do that? And then in 10 days after they won the 1967 war, 6-day war, they gave it back. So they actually did exactly that. And they've been struggling over this ever since, because the Jews cannot go to the Temple Mount and openly pray legally, or let's say in accordance with everybody's status quo. They're actually doing it now. My wife and I went for Easter to Jerusalem this year, and
Mm,
we saw groups of Jews actually, they're gathered together. They had a security detail, and but that was an affront to Muslim sensibilities that really they consider their other name for the Temple Mount is Haram al Sharif, which is really the forbidden place, right?
mm,
Haram is forbidden, and al Sharif, I forget what that means, but basically that's their name, that the forbidden place, that is the Temple Mount. Like that's the place that no non-Muslim should go.
mhm.
And so Jews have been sort of exerting more, presence on that Temple Mount, and they had these red heifers that they were going to sacrifice.
Yes.
And so Hamas came out with this other reason that was, that we had, because of the red cows, we did this war. And the red cows, people go, well, that's not a sacrifice, and it's not exactly. It's a ceremony, but it's opens the door for purification, which allows you to start the sacrifices. So anything they try to do right now for sacrifices and offerings would be essentially impure unless they're sprinkled by the ashes of the red heifer according to Mosaic law. So,
Mm,
yes, as believers and as Christians, we believe the law has been fulfilled by Christ's death on the cross, that we're now under a new law, a new covenant, which is
mhm,
grace, and no longer, it's not that the law was bad or abolished. It was completed. That contract was fulfilled by
mhm,
Jesus Christ, and now we've begun a new covenant, which was
mhm,
also prophesied in the Old Testament. There would be a new covenant, and that Jesus would be, that the Messiah would bring a new covenant. And so we see that in Jesus's life. But if you've rejected the Messiah, you're still trying to keep the Mosaic law, and that means reinstituting these sacrifices and these ceremonies. And so the Jews, in order to keep them from doing that, I mean, the Muslims, in order to keep the Jews from doing that, wanted to disrupt that. And actually they did, because if people saw the news, there was this big news blurb about 5 red cows. Finally, they found 5 perfect red cows. They brought them to Israel. They still have them. They've wanted to do the ceremony, but they haven't been able to because of this attack. And that was another big thing about the abomination of desolation, is that it says that it would be done to halt the sacrifice and grain offering. And so the nuance is, well, but they didn't halt directly sacrificing grain offering. They halted this red heifer. But halt can mean like to cause to be set aside and left undone, to prevent from being, accomplished,
mhm,
right? And so the attack was directly stated by them for that purpose, to keep the Jews from being able to reinstate these ceremonies, reestablish a presence on the Temple Mount, and essentially reestablish worship there, just like they're doing, currently, right? But Christians and Jews both are pretty limited in their access to the Temple Mount at present, while Muslims have, unfettered access anytime.
mhm. I just want to remind people that the Bible talked about this thousands of years ago. And if you go look right now, you can see that there were red heifers that were born in Texas. They were supposed to be sacrificed at between 3 and 4 years old, about 3 or 4 years ago. These perfect red heifers, it had to be a perfect red heifer, not a single hair, being white or black or whatever. So a perfectly red calf would be born for slaughter, for sacrifice. They were born in Texas. Go look it up. They were taken over to Israel. And so, from the Mosaic perspective, or from the Jews' perspective, it was, we don't believe the Messiah has come back yet. So we're going to continue the Mosaic law by sacrificing to cleanse this temple area, because we believe that the Messiah is still about to come. Meanwhile, you get the attack on October 7th that disrupted that whole thing, and it's all pointing to biblical prophecy. People go look it up. Um,
Yeah, it's wild stuff. Like
it's
it really
wild.
is.
There's so much to all of this, and I know that we're even in this conversation we're scratching the surface.
Yeah.
You have to have, you actually made a video that was very powerful, where you basically said that there needs to be a longing for seeking wisdom, seeking the understanding, and more than just, I think you said, a romantic love. You needed to
Yeah.
have the longing. Can you speak to that? Because I do think that that's a powerful and important message that people really need to receive and have the understanding of why there's a difference in those approaches.
Yeah, so it's easy for a Christian to say, I think, romantically, yes, I would love Jesus to come back. And we recognize this. This is something C.S. Lewis, if people have heard of him, really amazing Christian thinker and writer. He said we understand that something's just a romantic interest when it's like, oh, I'd love to go over to that far hill. And then, but if you do go over there, what you'll find is that it's not really what you wanted, right? So either it will just have kind of gone away, or you'll look at the next further hill and you go, oh, no, no, that's the hill that I should go to.
Mm,
And it's the idea that we can think we want something, but not really, actually have a true deep longing for it. But the return of the Lord is something we're supposed to truly long for. And one of the tests is if we're presented with the idea that the Lord could really be coming back, not someday, not on that far hill, but right now,
mhm,
what does that do? Does that cause, sort of revulsion, or does that actually produce excitement and true longing for the Lord's return? And so I think that's a good heart test, because one of the things that's different that I'm saying than what other people have been saying about Bible prophecy. Most Bible prophecy teachers are teaching about how they think all these things are going to come to take place in the future. Like, yes, we're close. They haven't happened yet, but we're still looking, that next farther hill. This is what's going to happen. And what I started looking at these events and saying, no, they're actually happening now. They're just
mhm,
not happening the way we thought they would look.
mhm,
And so we've got to reevaluate what we think this, is prophesied versus what we're actually looking at, and try to, reconcile that.
mhm,
And scientifically, someone could think, oh no, but that's just confirmation bias, right? You're just looking for what you want to see. But that's not, that can be true, right? But it's also true that the things that we're going to see, we shouldn't expect that we're going to perfectly imagine them how they are. So
mhm,
that in reality, when things happen, you have to directly test, what you've seen, and decide whether this is right or not. Because the Pharisees who studied the scriptures made this mistake. They're looking for the Messiah. They know all the prophecies about the Messiah, and yet Jesus, the Messiah, is standing in front of them, and they missed it.
and
They
they
don't
missed it.
recognize him. He's not doing what they thought. So then they count him out. And so even though the prophecies were being fulfilled, they weren't fulfilled the way that they thought they should be, and so they missed them. And so what I've been saying is that you've got to reevaluate what we think the scriptures are saying versus the things that are happening, and try to look for a pattern of fulfillment, not just on one event. Because yeah, fine, anybody can sort of look at one single event and start to think maybe that lines up. But what I've been doing since really April of 2020 is saying, oh, I think this is a pattern. I think we've got evidence that these next 7 years are going to be the time of the seals, trumpets, and bowls. And what evidence can we see that would support that idea?
Mhm,
And so for 4.5 years now, I've been like, these videos are assembling. Look, if that was true, then this thing should happen, and I think it did happen. And here's the event, right? And
mhm,
here's what it says in the scripture for that. And then here's the next events, and here's the next events. And so the abomination of desolation is the event that should have been at the middle. And I'm going, yes, I think that actually happened. And as we keep watching, sure, we have to keep an open mind. We have to keep evaluating. Things could change, but at the same time, don't lose sight of all the things that have happened. And if
mhm.
all this has happened, the likelihood that the rest is going to happen too, in my mind, is growing every day.
Absolutely. Um, it's probably your engineer background, but I love that you stress test your ideas,
Sure.
and that you throw it up against the wall against other models, to see if it breaks. And so for those that want to go deeper with it, you'll see that there's very, very compelling evidence. And honestly, at the very least, you walk away from it going, there's absolutely something here, maybe it's not 1,000,000% accurate, but there's enough here that the tectonic shifts are happening, and we're seeing evidence of that today. I wanted to list a couple of things that I have seen personally, and welcome your take on any of these. But Book of Revelation talks about the drying up of the Euphrates River. Apparently, that's happening. Also, the it talks about that the Euphrates River will dry up and demons will be released, I think it is. And that
Yeah.
there's and that and so as the river's going down, apparently there's caves with stairs and man-made stairs. Again, I've seen that on online, but anything online could be uh, false or whatever. But it's been reported, through credible news sources that the river's drying up. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's legit. People might go, well, but it's not supernatural. It's actually, the reason is because they've built some big dams, and there's sort of wars over the water because it is the Middle East. Water is precious.
Hmm.
And why should one country release the water to the other country that they don't really,
Hmm.
love, right? And so, but the net effect is absolutely what was prophesied,
Yes.
which is that the river is drying up. And
Hmm.
and again, it doesn't matter the means; it's only matters that what was
The
prophesied is
measurable
actually
outcome. Yeah.
happening, right?
Yeah.
It's the measurable thing. So we do see this now. There's some, because these demons are going to be released from the great river Euphrates, exactly what that we're talking about the spiritual domain now. So we don't understand exactly how that links with the physical, right? And
Hmm.
why is that, related to the river Euphrates specifically? But there are some places that then, because they're not flooded, they found were actually, yeah, some of these chambers down below the ground. People have reported hearing, really weird sounds.
Chains
And
clamoring and yeah.
you know, I don't know what you do with that. I haven't been there myself. So it's hard to have a direct opinion on it, but that's what we're told. I mean, it's noteworthy, right?
It's
And
it's noteworthy
so,
for sure. A couple other noteworthy things that I've also picked up on, talks about springs sprouting from the deserts. I think in Saudi Arabia, there's now big water that's just pouring out of the ground there. Um, uh, the Pharisees at one point asked Jesus, "When will we know when you'll return?" And he said, "You won't know except for the times of Jonah." I think, if
yeah.
I'm paraphrasing correctly, the eclipses that we had not too long ago in America, there was
Hmm.
two eclipses spanned by 7 years. One eclipse went from the northwest down to Texas, and when I say it went, the shadow of the eclipse started up in Salem, in the northwest, and went all the way down to Corpus Christi, which in Spanish means the body of Christ. It went over seven cities named Salem, which is an interesting, perhaps coincidence, perhaps not. The other eclipse that just happened a year ago, I forget exactly where it started, but it basically created an
In Mexico
X.
somewhere.
Okay,
Yep.
so and then it went to the northeast. It created an X. The shadow paths created an X over America, and that eclipse went over, I think, seven cities named Nineveh. Nineveh is a city that's referenced in the Book of Jonah, um, which, if you want to provide some context for that and why that's relevant, that'd be interesting. Do you have a thought on that?
Well, it was related to Christ, the sign of Jonah and his crucifixion, that he would be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. But it's also, because it's about Christ, you can see it as maybe a sign to his return as well,
Hmm.
right? And so then that's what is kind of interesting about that. And Nineveh also is a city that was actually visited by two prophets. It was visited by Jonah, and they repented. But then later, Nahum visited Nineveh, and the days of Nahum, Nineveh was judged. They didn't repent, and judgment came and fell on Nineveh. So America is kind of a Nineveh right now. So we've really, uh, well, actually, I like to say about America that we have both fresh and salty water, both
Mm,
sweet and bitter water flowing from the
yeah.
same spring. And so
Yep.
we're kind of a mixed bag. It shouldn't be that way, but obviously it is.
There seems to be a revival. I think it's possible if Trump is somebody that actually is supporting God's kingdom eventually. It in my mind, it is possible that there's been enough of a repentance of the country, enough of a revival back into the heart of Christianity, that we may have skirted worse of an outcome. I don't think that it's going to be easy sailing by any means moving forward. However, it's possible that there's been some type of mercy from God because there was enough of a repentance. Going back to what you
Yeah.
said a minute ago about America and its place in the world. I think as an American, as we're peeling the scales off our eyes to really truly see the rest of the world has probably been screaming for decades at the horrors that have come at the hand of America because we've been propagandized to think that everything's about freedom and we're liberating countries, et cetera. Meanwhile, there's a lot of really bad stuff that has been done in the name of America that as an American, I want to acknowledge and repent over to say, hey, look, I was deceived, I was fooled. However, um, if there's anything that was done on the name of Americans in the name of freedom, of liberty, et cetera, that I have championed, I want to acknowledge that sin, that wrong, and I want to acknowledge in my heart that that's a horrible thing. That people were bombed, that families were killed, and I think it's possible that America has been perhaps one of the greatest evils in the world. Uh, but to your point, the sweet and the salt, I think America has also produced some of the most God-fearing, incredible human beings. Some of the special forces guys that I talk to and the work that they've done overseas to truly save people from horrors is, in my mind, one of they're heroes in my mind. Those guys, not all of them, but I've certainly talked to many of them, and obviously the work that other Christians are doing in the realm of healing and bringing people back to the faith is also beautiful.
Yeah. No,
So
I agree with that. I mean, just a quick example,
yeah,
right? Why do we have Iran as, at the world's leading, state sponsor of terror? Because Jimmy Carter, 1979 or whatever, let them overthrow the Shah of Iran, and just we turned our back on that, and we allowed that to come to be, right? And
hmm
and how much death has come out of that? That simple, sort of seemingly innocent decision to not get involved. Like, there's some terrible fruit from that.
yeah.
Even the whole ISIS thing and pulling out of Afghanistan,
I
we've
was
done a
just
lot
gonna
of
say,
really, right, to take it all the way up to today, or to present times, but also the great ministries, missionary forces, a lot of the funding of feeding the world and all that stuff has also come out of America.
yeah, it's important. I think that people land on that as an American, we are, I believe, some of the best people, and I'm talking about the average everyday person. I think Americans are the biggest givers of the world. Whenever
Yep.
there's something that happens, we saw it most recently in North Carolina, when there were people literally from the entire country that just donated the time, money, energy, effort to help other people, other strangers.
Yep.
That's the best of us. And I think that we can unite unto that. Who cares what politics you vote for or whatever? If we can unite on that common ground, I think that's the best of who we are as Americans under the flag of freedom.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
I wanted to touch on one last thing here, and that's the two witnesses before we wrap
Mm,
up.
yeah.
Um, give the context of the two witnesses, why that's important in end times prophecy.
Okay, so there's two witnesses that will be going out and sharing the gospel and proclaiming, doing signs and wonders. Some people, debate over, well, when are they? They witness and testify for 1,260 days. Some people think that must be the first half of the 7 years and not the second half. And if people watch some of my videos, I make the case that it's also in the second half. There are two witnesses that are testifying at the same time that the beast is rising from power to power. But the interesting thing about that is that they're going to breathe fire. They're going to cause it not to rain. They're doing signs like Elijah and Moses. on the earth. And so the question would be, if we're in the last 42 months, which is my conclusion, where are they, right? And where should they be? And if they're going to be these two witnesses, shouldn't they be on CNN? And shouldn't they have already breathed fire out of their mouths and shown up at the Temple Mount on the beginning of that, and everybody knows about it? And I think that that's not the way it's going to be. I mean, if I'm right and we're in the time, it's definitely not the way it's going to be, because that's not what's happening. But I think if we look at the ministries of Jesus and John the Baptist, for example, Jesus and John the Baptist, neither one were widely known at the very beginning of their ministries. Their fame, that their knowledge of them grew over time. And Jesus wasn't doing tons of miracles on day one. He started light and then did more and more, and it grew with time. In fact, initially, he actually told people, don't tell anyone, because he didn't want to attract too much attention too quickly in his ministry. And we can only speculate about why, but you can kind of assume that, he needed it to grow small because he had a very specific point that he wanted to end at for his crucifixion. And he didn't want that to blow up too quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's the time that we're seeing now. I would assume actually that the two witnesses are here, but there are two people out of 8 billion. So that might take a little bit to find. Other people think that it's actually just symbolic of the two faithful churches. And if it's sort of symbolic, then, well, then no worries, they're already here, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the faithful church. It represents the two faithful churches, represent really the faithful believers that are on the earth right now,
Mm-hmm.
who are declaring these kinds of things, in general. But I think that it's going to be two actual people. And I suspect now that they won't really be fully revealed until the church is sort of raptured. And the rapture is another controversial idea, but that just really means Jesus coming on the clouds to gather his elect, at some point. And I think I think that event is actually going to come sooner or later. I mean, sooner than later. But if we're looking for people to do radical signs, I think those signs are going to increase as the signs of the judgments increase.
Mm-hmm.
So whether they're sort of going to take a greater role after the rapture, whether the rapture is later and they're going to start taking a greater role because judgments start to appear, it's a very important sign, and it's something to watch for. But I don't think it necessarily is something that we're going to be able to see, too quickly. So I think this is the mystery. Who are those witnesses? How are they called? When will they be called exactly? What does that ministry look like? If people haven't really talked about that, but just imagine two sort of apostolic type Christians. If you had a Paul and a Peter who were walking the earth again, how would we identify them? Like, would we believe them even?
Mm-hmm.
So this is a lot of the sort of the mystery about that. But by the time the end comes of that 1260 days, the whole world will know them, because it said they'll be killed by the Antichrist, and their dead bodies will lie in the street of Jerusalem, or mystically Sodom in Egypt, and the whole world will celebrate their death. So somewhere along the line, they're going to come to prominence, but I don't think that starts from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. To put all this in a nice, neat little bow, what can people do? What actions should they take if they're interested in finding out more, or even as a Christian, what might they need to do if these really are end times?
So there's a parable that warns the church that in the end, when Jesus comes back, there will be 10 virgins. 5 would be wise and 5 would be foolish. And the 5 wise ones would trim their wicks, and they would have extra oil, and they would be ready for the bridegroom. But the 5 foolish ones would not be ready, and they wouldn't go with the bridegroom. They would be sort of left behind. And so then the question is, I don't really worry about the foolish ones. I just want to be with the wise ones, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what does it mean to trim our wicks? And part of that is to cut off the excess and the black and the burned bits. And I think that's really about holiness. and what are the things that are in our lives that we know don't need to be there? What are the things that we need to repent of? What are the things that we need to let go of? And and that could be worry, that could be sin, that could be lots of things, but it's really about putting our hearts and focus on Christ's kingdom and not building our own kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And then the oil, I think, is understanding, it's faith, and that really comes from reading the word, from studying, from watching, from thinking about the things that we're talking about. I mean, there's a lot of Christians that won't even entertain this conversation that we've had.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They just don't want to go there because it's too scary. They'll say, there's even Jesus didn't know when the return would be, right? No man knows the day or the hour, so we don't need to watch and we don't need to worry about it, except that that's in direct contradiction to Jesus's command, which was therefore watch.
Mm-hmm.
And that command is to watch is the same kind of command that he gives us about then, to do this in remembrance of me, which is why we take communion and we drink the bread. As often as you drink the bread and the wine, do this in remembrance of me. Go baptize and go, disciple the nations. We do that because Jesus commanded it. But
Mm-hmm.
when he said watch, that's, I'm one of my last video, I said that's the most neglected command that Jesus gave.
Mm-hmm.
It's the one that we don't really teach as essential, like we
Mm-hmm.
teach baptism, communion, and evangelism. But
Mm-hmm.
watching is just as essential. It's a base command, and that's how we're ready and recognizing the signs. Otherwise, it says that there will be a great deception that will be so good that it will deceive even the elect, if that were possible. And so, are we one of the wise virgins or one of the foolish virgins? Well, it's our heart test, right?
Mm-hmm.
As we talk about this, are you excited about the Lord's return, or are you terrified? And if you're terrified, that's a time to think about, well, what does that mean about my heart? And do I need to repent of some things? Do I need to turn my focus away from the world and turn it back towards Jesus Christ? Because what he's bringing is not the end of the world, really. It's the remakeover of the world, right? It's the renewal of our bodies. It says that we'll be, when Jesus comes back, we'll be changed, like, in the twinkling of an eye. This mortal flesh that we have will be remade into immortal. And I think it's a glorious message of hope,
Mm-hmm.
not, the terror of the destruction that has to come before we can do the remodeling.
Yeah, something that came to me maybe 7 or 8 years ago was this really does feel like the end of the world. But dot dot dot, the end of whose world? The end
Yeah.
times for whom? The end times of what? Is it possible that what we're talking about is the end times of Satan, the end times of the
Yes.
evil, the end times of the deception? And in that case, is that not something that we should be celebrating and welcoming? Yes, enough of the deception, enough of the underground, literal and or figurative torment that has been happening on this planet for so long. I'm grateful as these things come about that it's hard to look, it's hard to process, but the fact that it's coming to light is part of the prophecy and part of the fulfillment. As we bring light to dark, you gotta the dark, can't exist when we bring light to it. And so, as these things come up, as they need to, apocalypse in the Greek original definition means to reveal. Are we
Yeah.
not going through a great reveal right now? We're seeing, things in Hollywood. We're seeing celebrities be demasked, if you will, politicians, etc. So, just again, another sign of the times. Christian, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah.
Let's give people a point of reference to go to if they want to find out more about you. You have the website, End Times Berean. Did I pronounce it
Yeah.
correctly? Tell people
Yeah.
what Berean is. I had to look it up, I admit,
Yeah.
but yeah, tell them the.
Berea was a place in the New Testament where Paul visited, and as he's teaching them, they're going and checking what he said to make sure it was right. And so, there's this idea that being like a Berean is somebody who actually goes and looks and digs in and checks for themselves to understand. And so I thought there was a need for some end times teaching that had that spirit of the Bereans, right, to really test and look at things. So for thinkers and people who want evidence, that's this website.
Awesome. So again, it's End Times Berean, Berean.com. You also have witnessingtheend.com where you can find your book there, which you give away for free, which is
Yeah.
awesome. Um, Christian, thanks so much again.
No, thank you, Peter.
All right, take care.